That Tuesday morning, Luke Harlan strutted into my office like he bought the building overnight. Less than 20 minutes later, he hijacked my chair, my authority, and the exact model I created to survive 3 massive recalls. Luke thinks companies are built on polished business cards. He never learned they are sustained by sharp memories and unforgiving files. When he finally opens the folder I left on his desk, reporting lines will not matter. Only career survival will. I am Ella Ward. For 17 years, I breathed life into the Product Integrity Division at Ridgeline Power Systems. At 41, my name was synonymous with quality control in the Rust Belt town of Ravenport, Ohio. I knew the low, vibrating hum of the thermal test lab better than I knew the quiet corners of my own home. I could smell a failing lithium-ion cell before the sensors even registered a temperature spike. It was supposed to be a perfectly standard Tuesday morning. The wall clock read 8:15. I had a cup of bitter, black coffee in my left hand and a thick stack of quarterly supplier evaluations on my desk. The rain outside was beating against the heavy industrial windows. Then, the frosted glass doors of the executive floor swung open, and the atmosphere in the room shattered. Luke Harlan walked in. He was exactly 30 years old, wearing a slim-cut, dark navy suit that probably cost more than one of my field technicians earned in 2 months. He carried the newly minted title of Vice President of Performance Integration, a role that had not existed 48 hours ago. But the chilling part was not his arrogant stride. It was the group he brought with him. Flanking him on the left was our Chief Executive Officer, Reed Holloway, a man who had suddenly forgotten how to make eye contact with me. On his right was our Chief Financial Officer, Dana Pike, her face set in a mask of aggressive indifference. Trailing just behind them was Marianne Cole, the Director of Human Resources, holding a clipboard like a shield. The ambient noise of the floor, the typing, the casual morning chatter, died instantly. The whole floor seemed to go silent. Luke did not politely ask for our attention. He commanded it by planting himself at the head of the open floor layout, right outside the glass walls of my office. He cleared his throat, a sharp, highly practiced sound designed to cut through the silence. "Good morning, team," Luke began, his voice projecting with the loud, artificial warmth of an overpriced corporate leadership seminar. "As we pivot Ridgeline toward a more agile, high-yield future, we need to aggressively streamline our operational verticals. We are entering a new era of performance metrics." He turned his gaze toward me. It was not a look of professional respect. It was a calculated, predatory targeting system locking onto its mark. "To that end," Luke continued, his white teeth flashing in a practiced smile, "I want to recognize Ella Ward. Moving forward, Ella will serve as our primary facilitator of legacy processes during this critical transition period." Facilitator of legacy processes. The words hit my chest like physical, blunt force blows. I was the Senior Director of Product Integrity. I built the thermal safety protocols from the ground up when this company was drowning in warranty claims. Now, in front of the entire executive floor, in front of the people I had hired and mentored, I was being verbally filed away as a dusty antique. "Effective immediately," Luke announced, raising his voice a fraction of a decibel to ensure every single cubicle caught the mandate. "All decisions regarding quality assurance, field failure feedback, and supplier evaluations will route directly through my office. Ella will report directly to me, ensuring our historical data accurately aligns with our new, aggressive growth targets." Marianne Cole stepped forward. Her expression was completely flat, devoid of any human empathy. She motioned to 2 men from the facilities department who were suddenly standing behind her, holding standard gray plastic moving crates. "Ella," Marianne said, her tone sharp and bureaucratic, "we are repurposing your office this morning. The executive team needs a dedicated war room for the new analytics division to map out the third quarter projections. Facilities has already set up a new workstation for you." I looked at my office. It was a prime piece of corporate real estate with glass walls, situated right next to the test lab, so I could physically watch the engineers pushing battery cells to their breaking points. It was a strategic location. It was my command center. "Where exactly is the new workstation?" I asked, forcing my vocal cords to remain perfectly level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a tremor. "Down on the lower level," Marianne replied, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Near the return logistics bays, the return cages." My stomach turned to ice. That was the isolated, poorly lit sector where sealed, defective, and potentially hazardous batteries were quarantined awaiting forensic inspection. They were moving me from the sunlit nerve center of the company down to the dark graveyard of failed products. It was a deliberate, physical manifestation of my newly diminished status. I was being exiled to the basement. I had no time to process the sheer disrespect of the physical relocation because Luke immediately fired up the massive 80-inch presentation monitor mounted on the main wall. The screen illuminated the dim room with a complex, beautifully formatted dashboard filled with predictive graphs and risk matrices. "I have developed a predictive margin compression model," Luke declared proudly, gesturing smoothly at the screen with a laser pointer. "This system will allow us to anticipate warranty costs and supply chain failures months before they hit the quarterly balance sheets." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the data points, the unique correlation algorithms, and the highly specific phrasing used in the subheaders. It was not merely similar to my own work, it was my exact work. For the past 6 months, I had been painstakingly developing that exact, highly complex model. I had kept it buried on a secure local drive, refining the complex mathematical logic before I felt it was bulletproof enough to officially present to the board of directors. He had stolen the entire structure, the proprietary language, and the core logic. He simply slapped a sleeker, more colorful user interface on top of my sweat and intellect. I desperately scanned the room, looking for a single lifeline, a single voice of objection. My eyes found Joe Beck, Mason Hale, and Travis Cole. They were the core of my team. I had trained them from junior analysts. I had fought tooth and nail for their annual raises. I knew the names of their spouses and children, but as I stared at them, seeking just one nod of solidarity, not a single one of them met my gaze. Joe stared intensely at the glowing letters on her keyboard. Mason found a sudden, fascinating scuff mark on his leather shoe. Travis intensely pretended to read a completely blank notepad. Their collective silence was absolute and deafening. This was not a spontaneous, erratic restructuring decision. This entire morning had been choreographed perfectly, and my loyal team had been pulled aside and warned to stay far out of the blast radius if they wanted to keep their paychecks. Then came the singular, microscopic detail that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. While talking about synergy, Luke walked casually over to my desk to direct the facilities staff on what heavy items to pack first. He reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers, pulled out a small, jagged brass key, and slid it directly into the heavy lock of my private, reinforced filing cabinet. That specific cabinet contained 17 years of highly sensitive, unredacted supplier histories, off-the-record field disaster reports, and the raw, ugly testing data that the marketing department prayed would never see the light of day. There were only 2 of those keys in existence. One was securely attached to my personal keychain resting in my purse. The other was locked in the maximum security corporate vault, accessible only by the chief executive officer under strict emergency protocols. Watching Luke confidently turn that key meant Reed Holloway had personally authorized this theft. This corporate assassination had been meticulously planned for days, perhaps even multiple weeks. They had systematically dismantled my authority, brazenly stolen my intellectual property, terrified my team into submission, and handed over the literal keys to my professional legacy before I even finished my morning coffee. I did not yell. I did not throw my hot coffee across the room. I did not give them the hysterical breakdown they were likely expecting and prepared to document. I stood absolutely, terrifyingly still amid the smoking wreckage of my career. I reached into my blazer pocket and my fingers found the cold, familiar metal of my heavy silver pen. I pressed the top down with my thumb. A single sharp click echoed loud and clear in my own mind, effectively drowning out Luke's hollow, endless stream of corporate buzzwords. I looked up at the empty spot on the frosted glass wall, where my silver nameplate used to hang just minutes ago. A profound, crystal clear understanding washed over me. This was not about modernizing ridgeline power systems. This was not a transition. This was a calculated, brutal purge, deliberately masked and dressed up in the shiny, palatable language of corporate innovation. They thought they had buried me in the basement with the dead batteries. They thought taking my title and my data stripped me of my power, but they forgot one crucial thing. You can steal a dashboard, and you can steal a filing cabinet, but you cannot steal the mind that built them. The ambush was over. The war was just beginning. It was barely 1 in the afternoon when the first digital blow landed, silent and devastating. I was sitting at my new desk in the basement, surrounded by the mechanical hum of the quarantine cages where defective batteries waited for inspection. The air down here smelled faintly of ozone and industrial floor cleaner. My computer monitor flickered as a new calendar invitation materialized in my inbox. The subject line read, "Department Heads Only Strategy Alignment." The organizer was Luke Harlan. I clicked on the attendee list. The names populated down the screen like a list of people I had hired, trained, and promoted. Joe Beck, Mason Hale, Travis Cole. Every single manager and team lead I had personally recruited, trained, and promoted within the Product Integrity Division was summoned to the executive floor. My name was noticeably absent from the list. It was a surgical strike. Luke was not just taking over my division. He was amputating me from the very body I had grown from nothing over the past 17 years. 2 hours later, a company-wide memorandum dropped into every inbox at Ridgeline Power Systems. The email was dressed in the sleek, aggressive branding of the new management initiative, titled Warranty Reserve Optimization Protocol. I opened the attached document and felt the blood freeze in my veins. The executive summary was written in Luke's signature consultant speak, but the 30-page appendix was entirely mine. It was a near-perfect replication of a highly confidential strategic roadmap I had drafted 6 months prior. He had stolen my words, my tables, and my fundamental logic. The sheer audacity of it made my vision blur. He even included the aggressive field failure forecast that Chief Financial Officer Dana Pike and the board of directors had explicitly rejected when I presented them in person last October. Back then, they called my numbers alarmist and detrimental to shareholder confidence. Today, packaged under Luke's name and his new title, those exact same forecasts were being heralded as visionary risk management. The isolation campaign accelerated with terrifying speed. Because my new desk was positioned near the freight elevator, I had a clear vantage point of the traffic moving between the lower levels and the executive suites. Throughout the afternoon, I watched the people I trusted most get summoned upstairs. First Mason, then Joe, then Travis. They each spent exactly 30 minutes inside what used to be my office. When they stepped off the elevator afterward, none of them looked in my direction. They walked with their heads down, their shoulders tense, hurrying past the return cages as if I were radioactive. I did not need to be in the room to know what was happening. Luke was dividing and conquering. I learned later that he sat my team members down, lowered his voice to a tone of deep, fabricated concern, and informed them that I was currently the subject of an active, highly sensitive internal investigation regarding severe leadership behavioral issues. He framed my quiet compliance that morning not as professionalism, but as toxic insubordination. He looked my people in the eye and advised them that if they wanted their careers to remain safe during the upcoming transition, they needed to align themselves firmly with the future. To cement their loyalty, he weaponized my own mentorship. The collaborative projects I had spent hundreds of unpaid hours quietly guiding them through were suddenly rebranded. Joe's thermal suppression redesign was no longer a team effort I supervised. Luke framed it as her individual breakthrough, achieved solely because his inspiring new leadership structure finally gave her the freedom to innovate. He bought their silence by handing them the credit I had helped them earn. effectively turning my own legacy into a bribe. The deepest, most calculated stab came at 3:45. My desk phone rang. It was the executive liaison for Orion Relay Cooperative. Orion was our most critical strategic client, accounting for 22% of our annual gross revenue. For 5 solid years, their engineering board explicitly stipulated that absolutely no component changes could be integrated into their purchased power grids without my personal physical signature on the engineering change order. They trusted me. They did not trust Ridgeline. The liaison sounded frantic. She demanded to know why a man named Luke Harlan was suddenly leading their quarterly compliance review call, and why he was aggressively pushing to substitute our standard ceramic insulators with a new series of cheaper synthetic polymer gaskets without my authorization. My breath caught in my throat. The polymer gaskets were a catastrophic thermal fire risk under high-load conditions. I had killed that specific vendor proposal twice already to protect Orion. Luke was not just stealing my job. He was hijacking my most critical client to ram through deadly cost-cutting measures that would compromise the integrity of an entire municipal grid. I forced my voice to remain steady, told the liaison there had been a severe internal miscommunication, and promised to follow up directly. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and genuine terror for what Luke was about to unleash on the market. At 5:15, the final trap of the day snapped shut. My inbox pinged with a direct message from Luke, requesting my immediate presence in his office, my old office. I walked up the stairs, my heels striking the concrete with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. When I pushed open the frosted glass door, Luke was leaning back in my ergonomic chair, his expensive Italian leather shoes resting casually near the edge of my mahogany desk. He offered a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a predator inspecting a trapped animal. "Ella," Luke said, steepling his fingers together, "please, take a seat. We need to have a very candid conversation about your current trajectory here." I remained standing just inside the doorway. "I prefer to stand. Tell me what this is about. Luke." His smile tightened into a thin, hard line. "I am noticing a concerning pattern. You seem to be struggling to adapt to the new velocity of this company. We are moving fast. We are cutting the fat. And quite frankly, your attachment to outdated methodologies is creating unnecessary friction within the ranks. If you cannot get on board with the modern vision, your current transitional role might need to be consolidated during the next restructuring phase." He was threatening to terminate me, wrapping the extortion in sanitized, bloodless corporate jargon. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to scream or cry so he could document my instability. I stared at him, keeping my facial muscles completely relaxed, offering him nothing but cold, absolute silence. After 10 seconds of suffocating tension, I turned around and walked out. I barely reached the bottom of the stairwell when my phone vibrated in my blazer pocket. It was an automated notification from Marianne Cole in Human Resources. The subject line read, "Performance Improvement Plan Initiation." I opened the attached document on my screen. It was a masterpiece of corporate assassination. The charges listed were dangerously vague and entirely subjective, impossible to disprove with hard data. I was officially cited for resistance to new methodologies, demonstrating territorial behavior over workflows, and actively obstructing the departmental transition. It was a meticulously crafted paper trail designed to terminate me with cause, which would effectively strip me of my severance package and my unvested stock options. The walls had completely closed in. I was trapped in a box they had built while I was busy doing the actual work. I sat down heavily at my new desk in the dim basement. The reality of the situation was crushing, but panic is a useless, wasteful emotion. I needed leverage. If this was a war fought with files and data, I needed to inspect the weapons they were using against me. I opened my laptop and pulled up the predictive margin compression model slide deck Luke had broadcasted to the entire executive floor that morning. The file had been distributed via the company portal for general reference. I downloaded a local copy to my hard drive. Luke was arrogant. He was a consultant who truly believed he was the smartest man in every single room he walked into. But men who manage from dashboards and never get their hands dirty always make catastrophic mistakes with the foundational details. I bypassed the polished presentation slides and dug straight into the document properties. I pulled up the advanced metadata. I ignored the author tags he had hastily altered to display his own name and dug deeper, looking for the raw, underlying creation logs generated by the operating system itself. There it was. Buried deep in the revision history of the file was the original source path. The exact directory string pointed directly back to my personal, encrypted laptop hard drive. The original file name embedded in the code was not his shiny new corporate title. The underlying data still carried my original working title, saved exactly as I had typed it 4 months ago. My heart slammed against my ribs, a heavy rhythmic thud in the quiet basement. This was no longer a simple case of a young, ruthless executive referencing a senior director's ideas and dressing them up as his own. He did not recreate the math. He did not retype the complex formulas. The metadata proved he had somehow gained unauthorized access to my secure local drive and extracted the raw proprietary file directly. This was not corporate maneuvering or aggressive restructuring. This was digital theft, a blatant violation of corporate security protocols, and I now possessed the irrefutable, unalterable digital fingerprint proving it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing lines of code in the darkened room. They thought they had buried me down here. They thought isolating me and taking my title would render me powerless. They had no idea. They had just handed me the very instrument I needed to dismantle their entire operation. I pulled my car into the narrow driveway of my mother's single-story house just after 7 o'clock that evening. The rain had stopped, leaving the Ohio air thick and heavy. I killed the engine and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. The silence of the car was a stark contrast to the buzzing neon lights of the return bay where I had spent the afternoon. The betrayal I felt was not just a professional bruise. It was a deep, visceral ache, rooted in the foundation of my entire adult life. I walked through the doors of Ridgeline Power Systems when I was exactly 24 years old. Back then, it was not a sleek corporate entity with frosted glass and executive war rooms. It was a gritty, disorganized manufacturing shop operating out of a retrofitted warehouse on the edge of town. The air always tasted like soldering iron smoke, and the company was constantly bleeding cash, drowning in an endless sea of warranty claims and freight returns. We were shipping defective units faster than we could repair them. I was the one who stopped the bleeding. I spent my late 20s fighting for every square foot of space to build our first dedicated thermal testing laboratory. I personally authored the initial supplier ranking matrix on a second-hand computer, creating a rigid accountability system that forced our vendors to meet actual safety thresholds instead of just hitting delivery quotas. When a major structural flaw threatened to trigger a catastrophic recall of our industrial power units, I did not delegate the crisis to a junior team. I locked myself inside the test lab for 3 consecutive nights, surviving on vending machine coffee and sheer adrenaline, running thermal cycles until I isolated the failure point. That single weekend saved the company tens of millions of dollars in contractual penalties and kept the doors open. I never managed my team from behind a mahogany desk. I led from the floor. I knew that Joe Beck needed to leave precisely at 4 on the second Tuesday of every month to take her mother to the oncologist. I knew exactly which shift to cover for Mason Hale when his wife was hospitalized with severe preeclampsia, ensuring he did not lose a single dollar of his hourly wage while he sat by her bed. I built a culture of absolute loyalty because I gave it first. That was why the silence of my team this morning felt like a physical knife twisting between my ribs. They were my people. But fear had a way of dissolving loyalty. I grabbed my purse from the passenger seat and walked up the concrete steps to the front door. Inside, the house smelled of medicinal cream and chicken broth. My mother was sitting in her recliner, her walker positioned carefully by her side. She was 6 weeks into a grueling recovery from a full hip replacement, and her medical bills were a constant, suffocating weight. "You look exhausted, Ella," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. It was a long Tuesday, Mom, I replied, forcing a gentle smile as I checked the temperature of her heating pad. Just a lot of shifting priorities at the office. I could not tell her the truth. I could not tell her that my job, the primary source of our financial stability, was currently hanging by a thread. Beyond my mother's medical expenses, I was actively splitting the steep tuition costs for my daughter, Nora, who was in her second year of an accelerated nursing program in Chicago. My ex-husband contributed what he could, but the bulk of the financial burden rested squarely on my shoulders. I did not have the luxury of pride. I could not simply storm into the human resources department, throw my badge on the desk, and walk away from a toxic environment. I needed my salary. I needed my health insurance. Luke Harlan knew that. The company knew that. They had calculated my financial vulnerabilities and factored them into their timeline. As I washed the dinner dishes, my mind turned away from my own history and focused entirely on Luke. Who was he, really? He was a product of a high-end restructuring consulting firm. He possessed a polished vocabulary and a dangerous talent for manipulating data to tell a very specific, highly lucrative story. But Luke had never stood ankle-deep in freezing mud in the middle of a catastrophic winter storm. Trying to figure out why a hospital's backup generator array was failing to hold a charge. He had never watched a lithium cell go into thermal runaway, feeling the terrifying, raw heat of a chemical fire that could not be extinguished with water. To him, our products were just abstract variables in a predictive margin model. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together with horrifying clarity. I thought about Reed Holloway. Our chief executive officer was not a malicious man by nature, but he was a desperate one. 2 years ago, Ridgeline had executed a massive corporate merger, swallowing a regional competitor to expand our market share. The acquisition had loaded the company with a staggering amount of high-yield debt. The grace period was ending, and the institutional investors were growing restless. Reed was facing a brutal quarterly earnings call in less than 2 months. The board of directors did not want to hear about the importance of rigorous quality control or the necessity of expensive, premium components. They demanded a beautiful, inflated profit margin to soothe the anxieties of their creditors. Reed hired Luke specifically because Luke was an assassin in a tailored suit. He was brought in to slash operational costs and artificially inflate the quarterly numbers. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel, my gaze fixed on the dark window above the sink. The narrative I'd been spinning in my head all day was fundamentally flawed. I had viewed the events of the morning as a personal attack, a power grab, driven by Luke's massive ego and his desire to steal the credit for my predictive model. But that was only the surface layer. The theft of my intellectual property was just a convenient bonus for him. The real war was significantly more dangerous. Luke did not just want my title. He desperately needed my physical absence. For years, I had served as the immovable barrier between corporate greed and field safety. I was the person who refused to sign off on substandard wiring. I was the one who blocked the procurement team from sourcing cheap, unverified thermal sensors from unvetted overseas suppliers. My reputation with our clients was built on that exact stubbornness. As long as I held the position of Senior Director of Product Integrity, Luke could not execute his aggressive cost-cutting measures. He could not substitute high-grade ceramic insulators for cheap synthetic polymer gaskets, because I would never approve the engineering change orders. By stripping me of my title, confiscating my files, and threatening me with a performance improvement plan, he was actively removing the final safety valve from the entire production line. A cold chill radiated down my spine, settling deep into my bones. The threat level had completely shifted. This was no longer a standard corporate thriller about a veteran manager fighting a wrongful demotion. The stakes were no longer confined to my personal career trajectory or my fragile bank account. Ridgeline Power Systems manufactured the heavy-duty backup battery arrays that powered municipal traffic grids, regional data centers, and rural healthcare facilities. If Luke forced through his unverified component changes to artificially boost the earnings report, he was effectively building thousands of ticking time bombs. He was actively falsifying the safety margins of highly volatile energy storage systems. When those degraded batteries eventually hit the field, and the first synthetic polymer gasket melted under a high-load surge, the resulting thermal fire would be catastrophic. But Luke Harlan would not be the one standing in the ashes. Long before the first unit failed, he would have leveraged his beautiful, fraudulent profit margins into a massive executive bonus and leaped to a new consulting gig at another vulnerable company. He would leave the engineers, the technicians, and the clients to take the full, devastating impact of the fallout. I walked into my home office and closed the door. The anger that had been simmering in my chest all day crystallized into something entirely different. It turned into a cold, absolute focus. I was not going to let a consultant burn down my legacy and endanger innocent lives just to satisfy a debt covenant. He had the executive team, he had my files, and he had terrified my colleagues into submission. But he vastly underestimated the institutional memory of the woman he had just banished to the basement. I sat down at my personal computer and began to type. The harsh blue light of my dual monitors was the only illumination in my home office. It was well past midnight, and the neighborhood outside was completely silent. Spread across my large wooden desk were 3 heavy-duty, encrypted external hard drives. They were my ultimate insurance policies. For over 10 years, I had meticulously maintained a shadow archive of every critical piece of data that crossed my desk. I had saved every single thermal test log, every rigorous supplier approval form, the dense insurance reports, the raw shipping manifests, and the highly sensitive warranty reserve allocations. I plugged the master drive into my personal machine and began the slow, methodical process of tearing down the shiny facade of our new corporate modernization. I started my forensic audit with the basic building blocks of our power arrays. I opened the logistics database and cross-referenced the current component manifests with our historical baseline. I immediately noticed a discrepancy with the alphanumeric codes for our high-capacity insulators. On the surface, the primary inventory system showed that Ridgeline was still purchasing from our premium, rigorously tested vendor. The internal part codes matched perfectly. However, when I bypassed the summary dashboard and dug straight into the raw, unedited freight tracking data, the actual point of origin had shifted entirely. For the past 2 months, the heavy wooden shipping crates were not originating from the approved manufacturing plant in Michigan. They were being routed out of a massive, windowless transit warehouse located down in Gulf Meridian. It was a classic, brazen tactic. They were keeping the premium part numbers active in the system, but physically swapping the safe components for cheaper, unverified, and highly dangerous alternatives inside a dark warehouse. It was textbook component laundering, designed to bypass my quality control checkpoints entirely. The component swap was just the physical symptom. I needed to find the financial motive. I pulled up the internal accounting ledgers and laid the warranty reserve allocations side by side with the incoming field failure logs. The warranty reserve is the large pool of cash a company holds, back to pay for future breakdowns. When a company wants to artificially inflate its profits for a quarter, they release money from that reserve back into the general revenue stream. As I stared at the numbers, the math became impossible. On the official financial reports prepared by the executive floor, Ridgeline's warranty reserve fund was shrinking beautifully, creating the absolute illusion of a highly efficient, flawless production line that no longer needed a large safety net. Yet, the raw intake logs from the basement return bays showed the exact opposite reality. The number of defective units coming back from the field was creeping up, slowly but with a terrifying, steady consistency. It was a statistical impossibility. The financial curve on the screen was simply too perfect to be natural. It was a fabricated reality, a heavily manipulated ledger designed to look incredibly attractive to institutional lenders. I needed to visualize the scope of the incoming disaster. I extracted the geographic coordinates of every single return logged under the classification of a severe thermal anomaly. I took those hundreds of data points and plotted them on a digital map of the country. A chilling pattern instantly emerged across the screen. The red dots indicating dangerous heat failures were not randomly distributed across our client base. They formed dense, highly localized clusters. I cross-referenced the dates of those specific grid installations. The clusters began appearing exactly 4 weeks after Luke took over the component replacement program and implemented his new vendor strategy. The cheap, unverified parts were already failing under pressure in the real world, and the executive suite was actively suppressing the failure rates to protect the upcoming quarterly earnings report. I needed to know exactly who was profiting from the shady Gulf Meridian warehouse. I scoured the most recent procurement manifests and found a brand new distributor silently inserted into the middle of our previously streamlined supply chain. The company name was Harbor Crest Trading. On paper, it looked like a completely standard, boring logistics intermediary. I pulled the public business registration filings from the state database. Harbor Crest was nothing but a hollow shell. It had no actual employees, no physical freight fleet, and no operational history. But the registered corporate agent listed on the incorporation documents matched the exact same registered agent for a small, aggressive boutique investment fund based out of state. I searched the public financial disclosures for that specific fund. 3 years ago, that exact same investment fund had paid an exorbitant sum in advisory fees to a young rising star at a prominent corporate restructuring firm. The consultant on that project was Luke. He was using a dummy corporation to funnel company cash through a shadow distributor, directly linking his current operational changes to his past financial backers. My hands felt numb as I opened a new browser tab and searched the financial history of the company Luke had advised 3 years ago. The historical timeline mirrored our current crisis at Ridgeline with terrifying clinical precision. Just months before that old company went through a massive, desperate debt refinancing, they implemented a radical, aggressive strategy officially labeled as a reset warranty program. The strategy artificially inflated their profit margins just long enough to successfully secure the massive new bank loans. 18 months later, the delayed warranty costs hit their balance sheets like a runaway freight train. The company collapsed entirely under the crushing weight of thousands of catastrophic product failures in the field. Luke was running the exact same fatal playbook right now. He was going to strip all the copper out of the walls, cash his massive integration bonus, and let the roof cave in on the rest of us long after he had moved on. I had the motive, and I had the financial trail. But supply chain anomalies and shell companies were circumstantial. I needed the smoking gun. I needed undeniable, unalterable proof of internal executive authorization. I ran a deep, targeted search through the archived internal communications server, filtering specifically for bypass approvals and protocol overrides. At 2 a.m, my screen locked onto a single, deeply buried thread. I clicked it open and felt the air leave my lungs. It was a brief, highly classified internal email directing the floor engineers to entirely skip the mandatory 72-hour thermal stress test for the newest batch of industrial power arrays. The justification listed was a vague, legally meaningless phrase stating an accelerated pathway was approved. At the bottom of the authorization line were Luke's initials. And right there, sitting quietly in the carbon copy field, was the direct email address of our Chief Financial Officer, Dana Pike. Luke was not acting alone as a rogue vice president. Dana Pike was fully aware that they were authorizing the shipment of untested, highly dangerous equipment, and she was actively helping him manipulate the accounting reserves to hide the impending disaster from the board of directors. I sat perfectly still in the quiet glow of my monitors for a very long time. My coffee had gone completely cold hours ago. I reached out and picked up my heavy silver pen from the desk. I pressed the top down. The dry, sharp click echoed loudly in the silent, empty room. I realized then that I did not need righteous anger. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger makes you shout in corporate hallways and write emotional emails that human resources can use against you. What I needed was a meticulously curated, weaponized file. I was going to compile a dossier so clinically precise, so heavily backed by raw data, and so legally devastating that I would not even have to fire the gun. I was going to place the evidence right in front of them and watch them pull the trigger on their own careers. I did not need a massive banker box full of documents to destroy him. I needed a scalpel. By 5:30 in the morning, I had assembled exactly 7 pieces of paper inside a standard, unmarked manila folder. It was incredibly thin. That was the beauty of it. A thick dossier invites arguments. A thin folder signals certainty. Page 1 was a simple line graph showing the unnatural downward slope of our warranty reserve fund. Page 2 was the geographic map of the United States, dotted with the specific localized clusters of catastrophic thermal failures. Page 3 mapped the sudden insertion of Harbor Crest trading into our previously clean supply chain. Page 4 and page 5 were blank, acting as a deliberate psychological pause. Page 6 was the kill shot. It was a side-by-side comparative analysis. On the left was the exact cash flow depletion model of the consulting firm's former client right before their catastrophic collapse 3 years ago. On the right was the current. Identical cash flow trajectory of Ridgeline Power Systems under Luke's new leadership. The numbers were different, but the aggressive, fatal velocity of the curve was practically a mirror image. Finally, on the 7th page, I used my heavy silver pen to write 3 highly specific questions. I did not include the answers, nor did I include the email chains proving Dana Pike's involvement. A smart strategist never reveals every piece of evidence at once. I needed Luke to know that I saw the entire illicit architecture, but I needed him absolutely terrified about how deep my shadow archive truly went. I drove to the office before the sun came up. The executive floor was dark, silent, and entirely empty. The air smelled of stale carpet and ozone from the heavy corporate printers. I walked straight into what used to be my office, bypassed his expensive leather chair, and placed the thin manila folder perfectly dead center on his mahogany desk. On the cover, I attached a single yellow square of adhesive paper. I wrote exactly 7 words. Before the lender deck, read page 6. I turned around, walked out, and took the freight elevator down to the basement. I swiped my badge to enter the quarantine testing lab. The environment down here was cold and clinical. I put on my heavy thermal gloves, pulled a charred lithium cell from a return crate, and began running a standard diagnostic test. The mechanical hum of the ventilation system masked the sound of my own heartbeat. I did not look at the wall clock. I simply waited for the explosive shockwave to travel from the 3rd floor down to the basement. It took exactly 45 minutes from the time his usual arrival window opened. While I was meticulously measuring the degraded voltage of a cracked battery casing, the heavy metal door to the return bay swung violently open. It was not Luke coming down to scream at me. It was Jo Beck. Her face was entirely drained of color, and her hands were trembling so violently. The metal clip on her clipboard rattled against the plastic backing. She looked around the dim room as if she expected the concrete ceiling to cave in at any second. "Ella," Jo whispered, her voice cracking under immense strain. "What did you just do?" I did not stop my diagnostic test. I carefully documented a voltage reading onto my notepad before turning my head to look at her. "Good morning, Jo. Is there a problem upstairs?" "Luke just ran down the main corridor," Jo said, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sheer panic. He was holding a plain manila folder. He looked like he was going to throw up. He did not even knock. He just shoved the door to the chief executive officer's suite wide open and slammed it behind him. And then, less than 15 minutes later, 2 armed corporate security guards stepped off the elevator and planted themselves directly in front of the finance wing. I slowly peeled off my heavy thermal gloves and placed them neatly on the metal workbench. The bomb had detonated exactly on schedule. Luke had opened the folder, flipped to page 6, and realized his brilliant, insulated scheme was completely exposed. The historical mirror was too perfect. He was trapped in a timeline of his own making. "Did you leave something on his desk?" Jo asked, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a frantic hiss. "Please tell me you did not threaten him, Ella. They are already building a paper trail to terminate you. Do not give them a reason to call the police. I cannot lose my job right now." I did not threaten anyone, I replied coldly, smoothing out the wrinkles in my blazer. I simply left some historical warranty math on his desk for the new leadership to reference. If they are having an intense reaction to basic division and subtraction, that is entirely outside of my jurisdiction. Joe stared at me. Realizing she was standing dangerously close to a blast zone, she did not possess the clearance to understand. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting to the heavy concrete walls, and practically ran toward the stairwell to escape the fallout. I sat at my makeshift desk, hands folded perfectly in my lap. I anticipated that Luke would storm down to the basement, throw his weight around, and demand to know how I accessed his past failures. I was prepared for a loud, abusive confrontation. I was ready for him to try and use his physical presence to intimidate me, but my desk phone remained completely silent. 10 minutes passed, then 20 minutes. The silence was heavier, far more dangerous than yelling. The absence of his immediate retaliation meant the damage I inflicted was beyond his personal capacity to contain. Finally, my computer screen chimed with an incoming urgent email notification. It was not from Luke. It was not from Human Resources. The sender was Celine Price, our general counsel. The message contained only one sentence directing me to report to Conference Room Alpha on the executive floor immediately. When the legal department bypasses your direct manager and summons you directly, the rules of engagement change entirely. This was no longer about a junior executive stealing a predictive margin model to pad his resume. By sending the top lawyer in the company to collect me, they confirmed that my thin little folder had pierced the absolute core of the corporation. I stood up, adjusted my collar, and walked out of the basement. I took the passenger elevator up to the third floor. The usual morning chatter of the executive level had vanished. The hallways were eerily quiet. I approached Conference Room Alpha. The frosted glass walls were completely opaque. The internal privacy blinds snapped tightly shut against prying eyes. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside the climate-controlled air. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive cologne, bitter espresso, and unfiltered panic. Reed Holloway was seated at the head of the long oak table. His hands were pressed flat against the wood, and he looked 10 years older than he had yesterday morning. Dana Pike sat rigidly to his right, her face an unreadable mask of aggressive defense, her knuckles white as she gripped a silver pen. Celine Price stood near the massive presentation screen, her arms crossed tight against her chest, holding my unmarked manila folder like it was highly radioactive. But it was the four strangers sitting on the opposite side of the long table that made the final piece of the terrifying puzzle snap perfectly into place. They were not internal staff. They were wearing immaculate charcoal suits. They had identical, thick leather portfolios resting in front of them, embossed with the gold logo of a massive, predatory Wall Street investment bank. They were the external debt refinancing team. Luke was nowhere to be seen in the room. He had been shut out of the room where the real decisions were being made. I looked at the bankers, then at the chief financial officer, and finally at the chief executive officer. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The stolen title, the relocation to the basement, the performance improvement plan. None of it was simply about operational optimization. It was never just about modernizing the product integrity division to look good on paper. I had walked into this room fully expecting to expose a corporate plagiarist who was taking kickbacks from a shadow distributor to feed his own ego. Instead, looking at the silent, furious faces of the executive team and their external lenders, I understood the true, terrifying magnitude of what I had just walked into. I had accidentally placed a live grenade precisely in the center of a multi-million-dollar fraudulent financial transaction designed to save Ridgeline Power Systems from total bankruptcy. And right now, I was the only person standing in the room holding the pin. Celine Price stood beside the massive presentation screen, her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask of legal defense. As general counsel, her sole allegiance was to the corporate entity itself. shielding Ridgeline Power Systems from liability at any cost. She placed my thin manila folder perfectly in the center of the heavy oak conference table. The four Wall Street bankers sitting across the room did not blink. They watched the exchange with the cold, predatory calculation of men who dealt in millions of dollars and zero emotions. Celine began, her voice perfectly modulated, smooth and entirely devoid of warmth. You have placed some documents on a vice president's desk this morning that carry very serious implications. In a sensitive financial period, we cannot afford reckless interpretations of internal data. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not lean back in my leather chair. I maintained direct eye contact. I have not implied a single thing. Celine, implications require interpretation and guesswork. I simply submitted verifiable data sets and a highly traceable document chain. The math speaks for itself. Reed Holloway leaned forward from the head of the table. He looked exhausted, the heavy bags under his eyes magnified by the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. Are you sitting in this room, in front of our external lending partners, accusing Luke Harlan of actively sabotaging Ridgeline? It is significantly worse than simple sabotage. Reed, I replied, my voice steady and completely flat. Sabotage implies he simply wants to destroy the manufacturing line. He does not care if the production line survives or dies. What he is doing is artificially inflating our earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. He is doing it by bearing the massive, inevitable costs of future catastrophic equipment failures under the floorboards of our current financial reports. He is fabricating a flawless balance sheet just to make the profit margins look attractive enough to close this refinancing deal. Before Reed could process the magnitude of the accusation, the side door of the conference room clicked open. A corporate security officer escorted Luke into the room. For the first time since I met him, Luke's flawless armor was cracked. His expensive silk tie was loosened at the collar, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He took a seat at the far end of the table and immediately launched a loud, aggressive counteroffensive. This is absolute, unhinged madness, Luke snapped, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. She is retaliating. I placed her on a formal performance improvement plan yesterday afternoon because she aggressively refuses to accept the new era of this company. She is a legacy manager, completely obsolete, desperately clinging to her lost territory. Now she is trying to tank a critical financial transaction out of pure vindictive spite. He turned toward the Wall Street bankers, forcing a desperate, artificial smile. Gentlemen, I assure you, this is simply the noise of a disgruntled employee who cannot handle the velocity of our modern transition. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. Anger is a weakness in a legal battle. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out my laptop, and placed it on the table. I opened the screen and turned it. So the legal counsel, the chief executive officer, and the bankers had a perfectly clear view. This is the raw metadata from the predictive margin compression model Luke presented to the entire executive floor yesterday morning, I stated clearly, letting the heavy silence of the room amplify my words. It contains my original file path, my specific authorship tags, and creation logs dating back exactly 6 months ago. But intellectual property theft is the least of your concerns today. Look at the active safety thresholds he secretly adjusted. I opened a second window, bringing up the highly classified internal testing approvals. He intentionally lowered the thermal resistance requirements by 15%. And here is the internal email, granting an accelerated pathway to completely bypass the mandatory 72-hour stress test for our industrial units. I tapped the screen with my index finger, drawing every eye in the room to the carbon copy field at the bottom of the message. This email contains Luke's authorization initials. But more importantly, Chief Financial Officer Dana Pike is copied directly on the override. Dana shifted violently in her expensive chair, her face draining of all color, but she kept her mouth firmly shut. The bankers immediately closed their thick leather portfolios in unison. The sound echoed like a gunshot. A suspended test protocol tied directly to the chief financial officer meant this was no longer an operational oversight. It was coordinated financial fraud. Celine Price intervened instantly. She was the ultimate corporate shield, and she recognized that the company was bleeding out on the boardroom table. She had to neutralize the blast radius. "We are halting all executive actions immediately," Celine announced, stepping between the table and the projection screen. Her tone was ruthless, stripped of any personal loyalty. "Pending a full, independent external forensic audit, I am placing both Luke Harlan and Ella Ward on immediate administrative leave. We must preserve the absolute integrity of the investigative process." It was a brutally cold, highly effective corporate maneuver. By suspending us both, she painted the situation to the lenders as a contained internal dispute rather than an exposed criminal conspiracy. I did not argue. I calmly closed my laptop, handed over my corporate security badge to the waiting guard, and allowed myself to be escorted out of the building. That evening, the heavy rain returned to Ravenport. I sat alone in my kitchen, a single dim light illuminating the counter. My mobile phone illuminated continuously in the dark. Ping after ping, the screen filled with frantic text messages from Joe Beck, Mason Hale, and Travis Cole. They were sending paragraphs of desperate apologies, begging for forgiveness, claiming they did not know how far Luke was willing to go. I ignored every single message. I simply watched the screen light up and fade to black. A delayed apology, sent safely from the comfort of their living rooms after the battle was already over, could not erase the agonizing silence that had killed my career on the executive floor yesterday morning. Courage is only valuable when it carries a real cost. At exactly 9 o'clock, a sharp, urgent knock startled me. I walked to the front door and looked through the frosted side panel. Joe Beck was standing on my porch, soaked from the rain, frantically looking over her shoulder toward the dark street. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled her inside. She was clutching a thick, heavy canvas bag tightly against her chest, her breathing shallow and erratic. "He manipulated us." "Ella?" Joe blurted out, her voice cracking as she stood shivering in my living room. "You have to believe me. Luke pulled every single one of us into his office separately yesterday. He isolated us. He looked me dead in the eye and swore that Mason and Travis had already agreed to testify against you to Human Resources to save their own salaries. He told Mason the exact same lie about me. He locked us in separate rooms and made us believe we were the absolute last ones standing. He promised that if any of us spoke up in your defense, we would be the only one fired, and we would lose our pensions." I stared at her, feeling a sick knot form in my stomach. It was a classic, flawless execution of the prisoner's dilemma. Luke had weaponized their financial fears, dividing a deeply loyal team by fabricating a false reality where everyone had already surrendered. He orchestrated a mass betrayal without a single member of the team knowing they were being manipulated in real time. "I am sorry, Joe," I said softly, the anger slowly draining out of me, replaced by a profound exhaustion. "But understanding how he broke the team does not change the fact that the team is broken." Joe shook her head violently, tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "I did not come here just to apologize, Ella. I came here to fix it." She reached into her damp canvas bag and pulled out a thick stack of aggressively crumpled, irregularly torn papers. Several of the pages were meticulously taped back together with clear packing tape. "When Celine ordered the entire executive floor evacuated this afternoon to secure the servers for the audit, I stayed behind," Joe whispered, spreading the damaged documents across my kitchen island. "I hid in the supply closet. When the security guards moved to the data center, I dug these out of the secure, classified shredder bin stationed directly outside Dana Pike's office." I stepped closer to the counter, turning on the bright overhead kitchen lights. I carefully smoothed out a heavily taped document. It was an internal accounting spreadsheet. Specifically, It was the highly restricted schedule for releasing millions of dollars from the Corporate Warranty Reserve Fund. I traced the columns with my finger, cross-referencing the release dates printed on the paper. My stomach tightened. The scheduled dates to artificially inject cash back into the corporate revenue stream were not tied to any actual production metrics, factory output, or historical repair cycles. The financial release dates were perfectly, flawlessly synchronized down to the exact hour with the external due diligence meetings scheduled by the Wall Street lending team. This was the Holy Grail. It was absolute, physical, indisputable proof that the accounting discrepancies were not a byproduct of negligence or aggressive business strategy. It was a heavily directed, deeply premeditated performance. Dana Pike and Luke Harlan were actively manipulating the financial health of the company hour by hour, choreographing a massive fraud to secure the refinancing loans. The battle was no longer about a stolen promotion or a toxic workplace. We were holding the physical evidence of federal securities fraud, and the real war had just arrived at my front door. I spent the morning completely detached from the Ridgeline corporate servers. My mandatory administrative leave was a disguised blessing. It gave me the uninterrupted time I needed to expand the battlefield. I used my personal encrypted network to track down Owen Burke. He was the former director of field reliability at the consulting firm's previous corporate casualty. I found his current contact information through a trusted mutual acquaintance in the engineering compliance sector. When I called him, he hesitated heavily, but the mere mention of Luke Harlan's name instantly broke his silence. I resigned from that company exactly 4 months before the entire warranty program detonated. Owen told me, his voice rough and bitter through the phone speaker. Luke came in acting like a visionary savior. He implemented the exact same strategy you are describing now. He called it an accelerated pathway. Did anyone in the engineering division try to stop him? I asked, pacing across my living room floor. We did not connect the dots fast enough to block the changes, Owen admitted, the regret heavy in his tone. The executive board only saw the beautiful, immediate profit margins. I am locked down under a watertight non-disclosure agreement. Ella, but an NDA cannot legally cover up corporate negligence or deliberate fraud. If you get me under oath in a formal setting, I can testify to his direct, verbal commands. He explicitly ordered me to delete 3 specific heat cycle failures from the final executive summary reports before they went to the board of directors. He is running the exact same playbook on you. That afternoon, the web grew even wider. I drove to a quiet, run-down diner 3 towns over from Ravenport to meet Camille Frost. Camille was a sharp, fiercely independent auditor who had thoroughly inspected Ridgeline's product liability insurance program late last year. She slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the sticky laminate table. I thought I was losing my professional mind when I reviewed the latest quarterly incident logs, Camille said, aggressively stirring a cup of black tea. The raw number of field failures is climbing steadily, but the severity classification codes have been completely scrubbed from the main system. I opened the envelope and scanned the highlighted rows of data. They are reclassifying the catastrophic failures. Exactly. Camille nodded sharply. A severe lithium fire or a complete thermal runaway is classified as a Category 1 disaster. But over the last 6 weeks, dozens of those exact thermal events were quietly downgraded in the reporting system to a Category 4. They are officially labeling them as an installation variance. They are legally blaming the local municipal workers and independent contractors for wiring the power arrays incorrectly. It is a deliberate maneuver to wash Ridgeline's hands of the thermal failures entirely and keep the insurance premiums artificially low. The puzzle was expanding with terrifying speed. It was no longer just about falsified stress tests. It was a highly coordinated, multi-departmental campaign of insurance fraud. I drove back to my house just as the sun began to set over the Ohio skyline. Mason Hale was sitting alone on my front porch steps. He looked thoroughly exhausted. His shoulders slumped as he held a heavy legal envelope in his lap. "Joe told me you found the restricted reserve schedules," Mason said quietly as I walked up the driveway. "I am so incredibly sorry. Ella, I was terrified of losing my mortgage and my family's health insurance. But I cannot let them blindly blame the field teams for these fires." He stood up and handed me the envelope. Inside were 3 fully notarized affidavits. One was signed by Mason, and the other 2 were signed by our most senior, experienced field technicians. "We visited a notary public an hour ago," Mason explained, finally looking me firmly in the eyes. "Luke's new operations manager explicitly instructed us to record the recent field overheating incidents as faulty ground wiring caused by the installation crews. But our portable sensor data proved conclusively that the battery cells themselves were exceeding maximum temperature thresholds long before the power load even spiked. We have the raw, unaltered sensor dumps saved on external drives to prove we were ordered to lie on federal compliance forms. I had the expert witnesses. I had the independent auditor. I had the falsified logs from the men on the ground. But I still needed the ultimate financial anchor to tie the entire conspiracy directly to the executive suite. Late into the night, I returned to my home office monitors and pulled up the shell company, Harbor Crest Trading. I had already linked its registered corporate agent to Luke's old financial backers from his consulting days. But a dummy logistics corporation still has to route its illicit profits somewhere. I dug deeply into the obscure, secondary tax filings of the boutique investment fund connected to Harbor Crest. I traced the massive, irregular dividend payouts flowing out of the dummy supply chain company. The money was not being reinvested into the corporate accounts of Ridgeline Power Systems. It was being funneled directly into a private wealth management trust, specifically a massive family office located in New York. I aggressively cross-referenced the names of the primary trustees managing that specific family office. The glowing screen blurred for a fraction of a second as the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the scheme finally hit me. The primary beneficiary of the family office was a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance was a highly prominent commercial real estate developer. More importantly, Arthur Vance was the current fiancé of our chief financial officer, Dana Pike. The corporate game abruptly morphed into something entirely monstrous. This was never just about a young, arrogant vice president trying to steal my predictive model to secure a rapid promotion. It was a brilliantly constructed, highly illegal mechanism designed to siphon millions of dollars directly out of the company. Dana and Luke were actively colluding to artificially beautify the corporate earnings reports. They were aggressively pushing the massive financial risk of exploding batteries into the next fiscal year, and secretly routing the fraudulent supply chain savings directly into the pockets of Dana's fiancé. Once the Wall Street refinancing deal successfully closed, and their massive executive retention bonuses cleared the bank, they would both resign. They would leave Ridgeline Power Systems to collapse under the crushing weight of the inevitable product liability lawsuits. They were packing the radioactive fallout into a separate, doomed entity, while they prepared to walk away incredibly rich. The sheer weight of the evidence sitting on my wooden desk was staggering. I had sworn testimonies, altered safety logs, metadata proving theft, and a direct, undeniable financial link to the chief financial officer. I could easily call the regional business reporters right now and watch the company burn on the morning news. I could send a mass, unredacted email to the entire corporate directory exposing the rot at the highest levels of leadership, but a public spectacle gives cornered executives the opportunity to scatter. If I released the information prematurely, Dana Pike would immediately claim complete ignorance. She would blame Luke for the supply chain anomalies, sacrifice him to the authorities, and deploy her massive legal resources to drown the truth in years of exhausting litigation. I decided to remain completely silent. I needed them to feel absolutely secure in their impending victory. I wanted Reed Holloway, Dana Pike, and Celine Price to continue believing that I was simply a bitter, obsolete middle manager desperately trying to save my wounded pride. I wanted them to truly believe my thin manila folder was the absolute extent of my leverage. I would let them march confidently into that final board meeting. I would let them shake hands with the Wall Street lending team, finalize the fraudulent financial numbers, and lock the heavy mahogany doors to cast their official votes on the refinancing package. Only when they were fully committed, only when there was absolutely no room left to retreat, deny, or deflect their involvement, would I wrap the heavy steel cable of evidence around their careers and pull it perfectly tight. The mandatory administrative leave dragged on, stretching the silence until it felt incredibly heavy. The internal investigation was officially stalled, lost in a deliberate bureaucratic fog. They were buying time, hoping the sheer weight of isolation would crush my resolve. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, a bonded courier pulled into my driveway. He handed me a thick, sealed legal envelope bearing the silver-embossed logo of our external corporate counsel. I carried the heavy package into my kitchen and sliced it open. Inside was a meticulously drafted exit agreement. It was a golden parachute woven entirely out of razor wire. The terms were exceptionally generous. They were offering me full executive salary retention for 24 months, a highly lucrative consulting retainer for the post-transition period, and the immediate vesting of all my outstanding stock options. But the wealth was conditional. Attached to the financial offer was an ironclad, 50-page non-disclosure agreement. Buried at the very end of the document was the true cost of the money. It was a pre-written statement of retraction, drafted by Luke's personal attorney. The document required my signature to officially state that my previous data submissions were simply over-interpretations of standard accounting practices. Luke wanted me to legally sanitize his history. He wanted my signature to act as an eraser, wiping away his fraud and transforming my legitimate warnings into a documented misunderstanding. My mobile phone rang exactly 10 minutes after the courier drove away. It was Celine Price. "I see the delivery was confirmed," Celine said, her voice abandoning its usual cold, authoritative tone. She sounded exhausted, bordering on desperate. "We are offering you an incredibly graceful exit. You take the settlement, you secure your family's future, and you walk away whole. If you force this to a legal war, the Wall Street lenders will immediately pull out of the refinancing deal. If that money disappears, Ridgeline will file for bankruptcy before the end of the quarter. Hundreds of jobs in Ravenport will vanish overnight. The manufacturing plant will close. You will not just be taking down Luke. You will be destroying the livelihood of every single technician on the floor." She was attempting to shift the moral burden of the entire corporate collapse squarely onto my shoulders. She wanted me to believe that holding them accountable was a selfish act of destruction, rather than an act of preservation. "I have a mother with mounting medical bills and a daughter in a nursing program," I replied, deliberately keeping my voice low and weary, feeding her exactly what she wanted to hear. "This is an overwhelming amount of information to process. Celine, I cannot make a decision of this magnitude over the phone. I need 48 hours to consider the offer and speak with my family." I could hear the faint, audible sigh of relief through the speaker. She believed she had found the structural flaw in my armor. She thought the combination of financial bribery and crippling guilt had finally broken my spirit. "Take the 2 days," Celine agreed softly. "Review the paperwork. Do the right thing for your family and for the town." I ended the call and tossed the unsigned resignation letter directly into the trash can. I did not need 48 hours to consider a bribe. I needed 48 hours to meticulously assemble the case that would bring them down. The anger simmering in my chest was absolutely controlled. It was a cold, quiet fury that demanded extreme precision. I spent the next 2 days transforming my home office into a war room. I did not build one massive, confusing pile of evidence. I built 4 distinct, highly customized dossiers, tailored specifically to the unique vulnerabilities of each target audience. The first binder was for the board of directors. For them, I focused exclusively on fiduciary duty. I organized the restricted warranty reserve schedules that Joe had recovered from the shredder. placing them side by side with Dana Pike's internal emails. I highlighted the exact timeline, proving the chief financial officer was actively manipulating corporate cash flow to deceive the board members themselves. The second binder was for the product liability insurance underwriters. They did not care about internal politics. They cared about risk exposure. I compiled Camille Frost's independent audit data, clearly showing how severe thermal failures were fraudulently reclassified as minor installation variances to keep the insurance premiums artificially low. The third binder was for the lead engineers of the technical team. This was about their professional licenses and moral integrity. I included the signed, notarized affidavits from Mason Hale and the senior field technicians, backed by the raw sensor data, proving the synthetic polymer components were fundamentally unsafe. I included the email where Luke explicitly bypassed the mandatory 72-hour thermal stress tests. The final binder was the most dangerous. It was built specifically for the Wall Street debt consultants. I traced the entire financial flow of Harbor Crest Trading, connecting the dummy supply chain corporation directly to the New York family office managed by Arthur Vance, the fiancé of our chief financial officer. It was absolute proof of a coordinated scheme to siphon corporate funds into private accounts prior to a major financial transaction. On Friday afternoon, the rain returned, casting a gray shadow over the town. Joe Beck and Mason Hale arrived at my house, parking their cars 2 blocks away to avoid drawing attention. They sat at my kitchen table, staring nervously at the 4 thick binders. "Human Resources called my department this morning," Mason said, his hands tightly gripping a coffee mug. "They are threatening to terminate anyone who is actively obstructing the transition. If we push this forward, we lose everything." "They want you to feel powerless," I told them, sliding a cup of tea toward Joe. "But you only lose if you fight them on their terms. If you shout about safety violations in the hallway, they will fire you for being disruptive. Truth does not win simply because it is the truth. It only wins when it is injected into the exact right room, backed by the exact right signatures, precisely at the moment they cannot afford to look away." I looked at both of them, my voice steady and unwavering. "You do not have to fall on your swords. You just have to stand behind the data when the doors lock." Late that evening, long after Joe and Mason had left, the storm intensified. Thunder rattled the window panes of my small workshop attached to the garage. I was reviewing the final page of the insurance dossier when a heavy knock echoed from the side door. I opened it to find Reed Holloway standing on the wet concrete. Our chief executive officer was soaked, his expensive wool coat dark with rain. He did not look like a man leading a multi-million-dollar corporate transition. He looked incredibly old and entirely defeated. "May I come in?" Reed asked softly. I stepped aside, allowing him into the dry warmth of the workshop. He stood awkwardly among the shelves of testing equipment and spare battery casings, refusing to meet my eyes. "I knew Dana was massaging the warranty reserve," Reed confessed, his voice barely rising above the sound of the rain hitting the aluminum roof. "Every financial officer does it to a certain extent to smooth out a rough quarter. We needed the lenders to see stability. I looked the other way because I thought she was just being aggressive with the accounting methodology." He finally looked up, his eyes wide and hollow. "But I swear to you, I had no idea she and Luke were setting up a shadow supply chain. I did not know about Harbor Crest Trading. I did not know they were physically degrading the components and funneling the savings to her fiancé. They built an entire criminal enterprise right under my nose. He was looking for an exit strategy. He came to my house in the middle of the night seeking absolution, hoping I would validate his deliberate ignorance and separate him from the active conspirators. He wanted me to tell him that he was just a victim of their deception. I did not give him a comfortable way out. I leaned against my workbench, crossing my arms over my chest. "You brought Luke in to do the dirty work because you did not want the blood on your own hands." "Reed," I said, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You gave him the keys to the company. You authorized him to strip my division of its power. And you purposefully ignored the red flags because the artificial numbers made your problems disappear. Reed flinched as if I had struck him. I am trying to save Ridgeline. If this gets out, the lenders will walk, the stock will crash, and the board will dismantle the entire organization. If you truly want to save this company, I replied, stepping closer so he could see the absolute conviction in my face. The first thing you have to do is stop trying to save face for the people who are burning it from the inside. They are tying a massive legal anchor to your neck. Tomorrow morning, you are going to sit in that boardroom and you are going to make a choice. You either stand with the people who built this company or you go down with the people who are trying to sell it for scrap. I walked over to the door and opened it, letting the cold wind sweep into the room. Reed stared at me for a long moment, the devastating reality of his situation fully sinking in. He pulled his collar up against the rain and walked slowly back out into the dark. I locked the door behind him, turned off the workshop lights, and went inside to pack the 4 binders into my leather briefcase. The storm was finally fully charged. The morning of the board vote arrived with a clear, bitterly cold sky over Ravenport. I bypassed my usual slacks and put on a dark blue tailored suit. It was not a defensive garment. It was the kind of suit you wear when you intend to take control of the room. I carried nothing but a thin manila envelope and 3 heavy external hard drives sealed securely inside transparent, tamper-evident evidence bags. When I stepped out of the elevator onto the 3rd floor, the atmosphere was electric with the quiet anticipation of a multi-million-dollar victory. The refinancing vote was scheduled to commence at exactly 9 in the morning. The executive secretary saw me approaching the main mahogany doors of the boardroom and immediately stood up, her hand reaching frantically for the security panic button beneath her desk. 2 large corporate security guards moved swiftly to block my path. They told me I was violating the strict terms of my administrative leave and ordered me to turn around immediately. At that exact moment, Celine Price stepped out of the boardroom into the hallway to grab a cup of coffee. I did not raise my voice or argue with the guards. I simply held out the thin envelope toward the general counsel. Read the first page. Celine, I said evenly, if you still want me escorted out of this building after you read it, I will gladly walk myself to my car. Celine frowned, snatching the envelope from my hand. She slid the single sheet of paper out and her eyes scanned the top paragraph. The transformation was instantaneous. All the blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain statue. She slowly looked up at me, then turned her head toward the 2 heavy security guards. "Step aside," Celine commanded, her voice trembling slightly. "Let her in. Right now." I pushed the heavy wooden doors open and walked into the absolute center of corporate power. The long table was fully occupied. The board of directors sat on one side. The external Wall Street debt consultants sat on the other, their leather portfolios perfectly aligned in front of them. Reed Holloway sat at the head of the table, looking pale and exhausted. Dana Pike sat rigidly to his right, while Luke Harlan occupied a prominent seat near the presentation screen, radiating an aura of absolute arrogance. I walked straight to the center of the table and dropped the 3 sealed hard drives onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed loudly, silencing the entire room. "You are currently gathered here to cast a binding vote on a massive debt restructuring package," I began, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "You believe you are saving Ridgeline Power Systems. You are actually voting to finalize a massive federal crime." Before Dana could shout an objection, Celine placed the document from my envelope directly onto the center of the table. "This is a legally binding side letter for the incorporation of a brand new captive insurance company and a separate service subsidiary," I explained, watching the board members lean forward in confusion. Chief Financial Officer Dana Pike and Vice President Luke Harlan designed this specific corporate structure to deliberately absorb all the post-transaction field failure costs. Their plan is to move all the defective units and battery claims into this isolated subsidiary and then intentionally bankrupt that specific unit within 12 months. They secure their massive executive bonuses today, and they leave the clients and the shareholders holding the ashes next year. Dana slammed her hands on the table. Her face flushed red with fury. She loudly proclaimed that this was a standard, legal liability isolation strategy, and that I was completely misinterpreting complex accounting methodologies because I lacked the financial education to understand them. I calmly reached into my suit pocket, pulled out a single sheet of printed paper, and slid it across the table toward the lead Wall Street banker.
"That is a direct internal email from Dana Pike to Luke Harlan," I stated, watching the banker's eyes widen as he read the highlighted text.
Her exact written instructions are to reduce the warranty reserve until the paper closes. That completely obliterates any defense of an accounting misunderstanding. It is premeditated, documented financial manipulation designed specifically to deceive the lending syndicate sitting in this room. The room erupted into chaotic whispers, but I was not finished. I reached over to the central conference phone sitting on the table and pressed the speaker button. I had coordinated this exact timing 45 minutes earlier. "Go ahead, Marcus," I said toward the microphone. The deep, furious voice of the chief engineer from Orion Relay Cooperative filled the boardroom. He did not mince his words. He explicitly informed the board of directors that Luke Harlan had officially submitted engineering change orders to their municipal grid project. Those specific documents contained my forged electronic signature. Luke had legally guaranteed the client that I had personally evaluated and approved the highly dangerous synthetic polymer substitution. Despite the contract strictly requiring my physical authorization, he committed felony forgery on a federal utility contract simply to push his cheap supply chain through. The Wall Street consultants immediately began packing their leather briefcases. The lead banker looked at Reed Holloway with absolute disgust, preparing to declare the entire refinancing deal dead on arrival, but I needed to lock the doors on the executives completely. "At 8 o'clock this morning," I continued, speaking over the rising panic in the room, "our independent auditor, Camille Frost, officially notified the underwriting syndicate. The safety compliance certificates provided in your due diligence packets contain material misrepresentations. The thermal safety logs were intentionally altered to hide catastrophic failures. This is no longer a simple financial vote. This room is now the epicenter of a massive legal liability zone." Luke suddenly lunged across the mahogany table. He snatched the copied side letter and the shell company appendices from the banker's hands. He frantically scanned the pages, desperately searching for a loophole. He truly believed that my files were solely aimed at him, isolating him as a rogue actor taking the fall, but his frantic eyes locked onto the beneficiary lines of the dummy corporations. He saw Dana Pike's signature resting permanently right next to his own on the profit distribution agreements. He realized in that agonizing second that Dana had legally structured the holding company to ensure she retained the primary financial payout, effectively using him as her highly disposable, easily blamed architect. For the first time since he confidently strolled into my office and stole my desk, the polished, untouchable mask of the young vice president shattered completely. His hands shook so violently that the papers rattled loudly against each other. The color drained from his lips, and he slowly collapsed back into his leather chair, absolutely paralyzed by the inescapable reality of his own hubris. Reed Holloway finally stood up. His voice was entirely hollow, stripped of any executive authority. "Suspend the vote," Reed choked out, staring blankly at the far wall. "This meeting is immediately adjourned." Celine Price immediately took control of the crisis. She pulled out her mobile phone and loudly ordered corporate security to lock down the entire executive floor. She instructed the information technology department to instantly freeze every single server, laptop, and communication network in the building to preserve the data footprint. No one was permitted to leave the room. The executives and the board members, who had walked through those heavy doors 30 minutes ago expecting to toast a brilliant and lucrative future, suddenly understood the devastating truth. They were sitting completely trapped in the center of a catastrophic fraud that was about to drag the entire company down into the abyss. The boardroom descended into absolute chaos the moment the heavy doors were locked. Dana Pike did exactly what cornered predators do when trapped. She immediately turned on the weakest member of the pack. She stood up, smoothing her expensive skirt with trembling hands, and pointed directly at Luke. "This was a rogue operation," Dana declared, her voice shrill with manufactured outrage. "He acted entirely alone. He is an inexperienced, overambitious young vice president who vastly overstepped his operational authority to secure an integration bonus. I was completely unaware of the shadow supply chain." Luke stared at her, the final remnants of his polished corporate facade dissolving into pure, unadulterated hatred. He did not argue or yell in his defense. He simply reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his mobile phone, and placed it flat on the mahogany table. He tapped the screen once. The crystal-clear audio of a recorded phone call echoed through the silent, electrified room. It was Dana's voice, sharp and commanding. "I do not care how you justify the thermal tests," the recorded voice of the chief financial officer snapped. "Smooth the reserve story until the refinancing paper closes. Do whatever it takes to bury the future liabilities until we get the cash." Luke looked up at her, a bitter, hollow smile forming on his lips. "I spent 5 years in corporate restructuring. Dana," he whispered coldly. "I never, ever take a fall for the chief financial officer." Reed Holloway dropped his head heavily into his hands. The Wall Street bankers did not say a single word. They simply stood up in perfect unison, picked up their leather briefcases, and walked out of the room, effectively taking millions of dollars in financial lifelines with them. Reed slowly raised his head, looking at the remaining board of directors. "I am officially freezing the entire document package sent to the lenders," the chief executive officer announced, his voice dead and defeated. "I am halting the vote immediately, and I am asking this board to strip Dana Pike and Luke Harlan of all executive functions, effective this exact minute." The internal bleeding was severe, but the external hemorrhage started exactly 2 hours later. A pair of federal couriers arrived at the front reception desk. They delivered sweeping, legally binding document preservation orders directly from the National Commerce Integrity Bureau and the Commercial Fraud Task Group. The corporate dispute had officially mutated into a massive federal investigation, entirely outside the control of the Human Resources Department. At noon, I stood quietly near the elevator banks and watched 2 armed corporate security guards escort Luke out of the building. He carried a small cardboard box containing a few personal items. He did not look at me. His downfall was a masterpiece of his own making. He was not being paraded out of the lobby simply because he stole my strategic model or tried to humiliate me. He was leaving because the exact moment he opened that thin manila folder on his desk and saw his own history staring back at him, he reacted like a profoundly guilty man. His sheer panic had accelerated his own execution, exposing the deepest, most sensitive nerve of the entire operation. The company was entirely shattered, but the pieces still had to be swept up and reassembled. By 3 p.m, Ridgeline Power Systems was on the verge of losing the Orion Relay Cooperative contract, an event that would guarantee immediate bankruptcy. I walked into the crisis management room, picked up the conference phone, and spoke directly to their engineering board. I did not offer them corporate excuses or sanitized apologies. I offered them a brutally honest remediation plan. I personally co-signed the new engineering protocols. I forced Ridgeline to immediately reinstate the mandatory 72-hour thermal stress tests. We initiated a massive, expensive recall for every single high-risk battery array shipped in the last 60 days, and we legally severed all ties with the Harbor Crest supply chain. Orion agreed to stay, but only because my personal signature was on the bottom line. The reckoning within my own department was swift and deeply uncomfortable. My inbox was flooded with public apologies from the team members who had bowed to Luke's intimidation. I forgave Joe Beck, Mason Hale, and the field technicians who ultimately found the courage to secure the vital evidence when it mattered most. But several others, the ones who had fully embraced the new regime and actively participated in freezing me out, quietly submitted their resignations by the end of the week. They finally understood the heavy, unforgiving price of cowardice during a critical moment of decision. On Friday morning, Reed Holloway called me into his temporary office. The massive, opulent chief executive suite was currently occupied by forensic auditors. Reed looked completely drained, a man who had narrowly survived a shipwreck but lost half his crew in the process. He slid a piece of heavy stock paper across his desk. It was a formal offer for the position of Vice President of Performance Integration, the exact title Luke had fabricated. I looked at the paper, then pushed it gently back across the desk. I do not want the title, Reed. I do not want the corner office, and I do not want the politics. Reed looked genuinely confused. Then what exactly do you want? Ella, I want a fully executed legal document officially restoring my authorship of the predictive margin compression model, I replied, my voice calm and unwavering. I want a 12-month contract as a special advisor, reporting only to the board of directors. I want absolute, independent authority to completely rebuild the product integrity system under my own strict conditions, with zero interference from the finance department. And I want guaranteed, fully funded retention bonuses for every single analyst and field technician who chose to stand by the truth instead of succumbing to executive fear. Reed stared at me for a long time, recognizing that he had absolutely no leverage left to negotiate. He slowly reached for his pen and signed the terms. The most beautiful, satisfying revenge I enacted was not screaming at Luke Harlan in front of the entire executive floor. I did not throw coffee, and I did not break anything. My revenge was precise and clinical. I made sure every single lie he told was securely nailed to the wall with undeniable data, authenticated signatures, and the exact, perfect timing where he could no longer run from the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless greed. On Monday morning, I did not return to my old, pristine office with the frosted glass walls. I instructed the facilities team to set up a brand new, highly functional desk right against the heavy observation window overlooking the thermal test lab. I wanted to be as close to the actual pulse of the company as possible. I sat down in my chair, the low hum of the testing equipment vibrating comfortably through the floorboards. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my familiar silver pen, and placed it down softly on the cover of a blank, fresh notebook. I sat there, breathing in the scent of ozone and hot metal, entirely at peace. I was a woman who never needed a fancy title on a door to understand her true, undeniable value. And that profound, unshakable calm was the final, deepest cut to all the people who ever thought they could simply erase me from the story. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts on the corporate battlefield. If you enjoyed this journey, do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your ultimate support by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the globe.